Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Pavla Niklova. I'm the Executive Director of the Vaclav Havel Library Foundation, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you at the Bohemian National Hall for the night that is dedicated to Franz Kafka's Diaries. I would like to thank the 92nd NY's Unterberg Poetry Center, who are our partners for tonight, and particularly Bernard Schwartz, who had this wonderful idea to bring this program south of the place where they usually have their events. For the Havel Foundation, this evening is a part of our spring stage readings, as well as our Havel Conversation series. We have three distinguished guests: the author of the new translation of Franz Kafka's Diaries, Ros Benjamin, translator of German literature, a 2015 Guggenheim Fellow. Ros will introduce our program and later will be in conversation with Veronika Tuckerova, a literary scholar at Harvard University's Slavic department, who has recently completed a book on the Czechoslovak reception of Kafka from 1920s to 1989. The reading of Franz Kafka's Diaries will be performed by the praised actor Josh Hamilton, whose theater credits include Tom Stoppard's The Real Thing and The Coast of Utopia. I'd like to thank our supporters, the Bohemian, Benevolent and Literary Association, the Consulate General of the Czech Republic in New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, New York City Council, and New York State Council on the Arts. I come from Prague, and for us, of course, Franz Kafka is one of the most cherished citizen and writer of Prague. During the 40 years after the Second World War, he was basically banned in communist Czechoslovakia. And then after the Velvet Revolution in 1989, we got to the other extreme when Franz Kafka became one of the most popular merchandise in Prague, and who you can basically run into him at every corner. And I hope that we have moved from this phase, and these days many wonderful Czech cultural institutions are working on special exhibitions and seminars connected with both Kafka's anniversary that we will be celebrating this year and commemorating next year. Also, the Jewish Museum in Prague will prepare a special app, and you will be able, if you come, to walk around the old town and find out about Franz Kafka and the neighborhood where he used to live. And the reason why I know about it is that after 13 years of living in this exciting city, I've been honored to lead the Jewish Museum in Prague, and I will be starting in summer. And so I hope you will come to visit us, either for Franz Kafka's event or many other events that we plan for 2026, when the museum will celebrate already its 120 years of existence. It's a beautiful institution full of history and stories, and I'm telling you well in advance, so plan your trip for 2026. Now it's the best time to turn off all your electric devices, and I'd like to ask you to join me in welcoming Ros Benjamin.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. I love Prague. I guess it's obvious. If I love Kafka, I love Prague. But I also love the Jewish Museum. It's so great to hear that. And congratulations. Franz Kafka's Diaries, which he kept between 1909 and 1923, reveal the unsparing self-examination and open-ended literary experimentation of one of the most visionary and influential figures of modern literature. This evening, the gifted and acclaimed actor Josh Hamilton will present to you selections from my new translation, which gives English-speaking readers access to the complete, uncensored diaries for the first time. The sole previous English version, first published in 1948-49, was based on a Baudelarized German edition prepared by Kafka's intimate friend and literary executor Max Brod, who had cut a substantial amount of material and made other intrusive alterations to the text that drastically misrepresented it. With his heavy-handed editorial interventions, Brod sanitized and sanctified Kafka, diminishing his complexity as a writer and as a human. My translation is based on the original text of Kafka's handwritten notebooks, as faithfully transcribed in the 1990 German critical edition. Kafka's unexpurgated, undistorted diaries open a window into his inner life and creative process in all their complexity. A record of his often abortive attempts to transfer to the page what he called the tremendous world I have in my head, the diaries contain much that is fragmentary and disjointed, stumbling and stuttering. In the same notebook, Kafka would alternate among different modes of writing, jotting down observations and reflections, drafting letters and fiction, describing his dreams, now and then interspersing drawings. He crossed things out, made corrections and insertions, relentlessly reworked texts in successive variations. He wrote in fits and starts, constantly breaking off and beginning again. In the haste and spontaneity of diary writing, he penned unpolished, error-strewn prose. This fertile disarray had hardly been visible in Brod's edition and its English translation. Since much of the raison d'etre of my translation was to leave the untidiness untouched, it's been an interesting project to prepare a script for this evening. Unlike Brod, who tried to pass off a falsely smooth, cohesive product as the diaries themselves, I want to stress at the outset that I've stitched together a series of passages that are, in the actual notebooks, as in the edition I've translated, strewn throughout a far more heterogeneous and haphazard collection of scraps. A theme to which Kafka returns again and again from the beginning to the end of the diaries is his struggle with his writing. It's he probably wouldn't have hesitated to say, the central drama and predicament of his life. By tracing this one thread, I've sought to convey a sense of Kafka not fully formed, monumentalized, and mythologized, or merchandised, but still in the midst of becoming who he is, in a state of flux and instability, wrestling his voice, idiom, and sensibility into being, and experiencing acutely the frustrations, self-torments, self-recriminations, and also elations and ecstasies of this process, and himself dramatizing it, giving it literary and poetic form. At the start of these diary entries, it's 1910, and Kafka is 26 years old and living in Prague, the city of his birth. Unmarried, he still lives in his parents' apartment. The Kafkas are middle-class, assimilated, German-speaking Jews. German is the language of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, to which the Kingdom of Bohemia and its capital city of Prague belong, but the surrounding ethnic majority is Czech-speaking and increasingly striving for national sovereignty. By day, Kafka works as an official at the Workers' Accident Insurance Institute for the Kingdom of Bohemia. By night, he is an insomniac scribe of the liminal zone between waking and dreaming. Many nights, he also goes to the theater, concerts, recitations, lectures, spends time with his close circle of friends, flirts with waitresses and actresses, even visits brothels. This nocturnal life, too, is recorded in the diaries, but it's not the focus of this evening's performance. While alive, Kafka published several collections of his stories, but never completed the novels he'd begun. From 1917 until his death in 1924, at the age of 40, he suffered from tuberculosis. Despite Kafka's testamentary instructions to burn all his papers, Max Brod brought Kafka's unpublished writing into print, including his unfinished novels, The Trial, The Castle, and what Brod titled America. Together with Brod's editions of the diaries, letters, and aphorisms, these publications brought Kafka worldwide renown far beyond what he had experienced in his lifetime. The selections that you're about to witness being brought to life by Josh Hamilton are all from my new translation of the Diaries. They span the period from late 1910 until June 1923, about a year before Kafka died. The last words you'll hear are the last words he wrote in his diaries. Now please welcome Josh Hamilton.
At last, after 5 months of my life in which nothing I wrote could satisfy me and for which no power will compensate me, though all would be obligated to do so, it occurs to me to speak to myself once again. When I really asked myself a question, I still responded. Here, there was still something to be wrested from me, from this heap of straw that I have been for 5 months, and whose fate, it seems, is to be set alight in the summer and to burn away before the spectator can blink. If only that would happen to me. And it should happen to me 10 times over, for I don't even regret the unhappy time. My condition is not unhappiness, but it's not happiness either. Not indifference, not weakness, not fatigue, not interest in anything else. So what is it then? The fact that I don't know is probably connected with my inability to write. And this is something I think I understand without knowing its cause. For whatever things occur to me occur not from the root, but beginning somewhere toward their middle. Just let someone try to hold them. Let someone try to hold and cling to a blade of grass that only starts growing from the middle. Perhaps some can. Japanese acrobats, for example, who climb a ladder that isn't resting on the ground, but on the upturned soles of a partner lying on his back, and isn't leaning against a wall, but goes straight up into the air. This is more than I can manage. Not to mention the fact that my ladder doesn't have even those soles at its disposal. That's not all, of course, and such a question still isn't enough to make me speak. But each day, at least one line should be pointed at me, as people are now pointing telescopes at the comet. And if I would then appear once before that sentence, lured by that sentence, as I was last Christmas, for example, when I had gone so far that I could only barely contain myself, and when I really seemed to be on the last rung of my ladder, which, however, stood steadily on the ground and against the wall. But what a ground, what a wall. And yet that ladder didn't fall. So firmly did my feet press it against the ground. So firmly did my feet raise it against the wall. December 16th, 1910. I will no longer abandon the diary. Here I must hold on, for only here can I. I would like to explain the feeling of happiness that I have within me from time to time, as I do right now. It's really something effervescent that fills me completely with a slight pleasant tremor, and that persuades me of abilities of whose non-existence I can convince myself with absolute certainty at any moment, even now. December 27th, 1910. I don't have enough strength for another sentence. Yes, if it were a matter of words, if it sufficed to set down a word, and one could turn away in the calm consciousness of having filled this word completely with oneself. January 7th, 1911. As if by magic, for neither external nor internal circumstances, which are now more congenial than they have been for a year, hindered me, I was kept from writing all through the free day. It's a Sunday. Some new insights into the creature of unhappiness that I am have consolingly dawned on me. January 12th, 1911. I haven't written much about myself in recent days, partly out of laziness. I now sleep so much and so soundly during the day, I have a greater weight while asleep. But also partly out of fear of betraying my self-knowledge. This fear is justified, for one's self-knowledge should be fixed once and for all in writing only when this could be done in the greatest completeness, extending to all incidental consequences, as well as with total truthfulness. For if this is not done, and I'm certainly not capable of it, then what has been written down, in accordance with its own intention and with the superior power of what has been fixed, replaces what has been merely generally felt, only in such a way that the real feeling fades while the worthlessness of what has been noted down is recognized too late. January 19th, 1911. Every day, since I seem to be utterly done for, in the past year, I have woken up for no more than 5 minutes. I will either have to wish myself off the earth, or else, without being permitted to see even the most moderate hope in it, begin anew as a small child. This will be outwardly easier for me than at the time, for in those days I still strove, with scarcely a faint suspicion, for a depiction that would be connected with my life from word to word, that I would draw to my breast and that would carry me away from where I was. With what misery, incomparable certainly to the present one, I began. What coldness pursued me for days from what I had written. How great the danger was, and how almost uninterruptedly I was at work, so that I didn't feel the coldness at all, which, to be sure, didn't diminish my unhappiness much on the whole. Once I planned a novel in which two brothers fought each other, one of whom went to America while the other remained in a European prison. I began to write lines only now and then, for it tired me immediately. Thus, one Sunday afternoon, when we were visiting my grandparents and had eaten the especially soft bread spread with butter that was always customary there, I wrote down something about my prison. It's quite possible that I did this for the most part out of vanity, and by shifting the paper on the tablecloth, tapping with the pencil, looking around in the group under the lamp, I wanted to tempt someone to take from me what I had written, look at it, and admire me. The few lines describe mainly the corridor of the prison, above all its silence and coldness. A sympathetic word was also said about the brother who stayed behind, because he was the good brother. Perhaps I had a momentary feeling of the worthlessness of my description. Only before that afternoon, I never paid much attention to such feelings when I sat among relatives to whom I was accustomed. My anxiousness was so great that the accustomed was enough to make me halfway happy, around the round table in the familiar room, and could not forget that I was young and called out of this present tranquility to great things. An uncle, who liked to laugh at people, finally took from me the sheet of paper which I was holding only weakly, looked at it briefly, handed it back to me without even laughing, and said only to the others who followed him with their eyes, "The usual stuff." To me, he said nothing. Though I remained seated and bent over as before over my thus unusable sheet of paper, I had actually been driven out of the social sphere with one push. My uncle's judgment repeated itself in me with now almost real significance, and even within the family feeling, I got an insight into the cold space of our world, which I had to warm with a fire that I first wanted to seek. February 19th, 1911. The special nature of my inspiration, in which I, the happiest and unhappiest of men, am now going to bed at 2:00 in the night. Perhaps, if I can only bear the thought of it, it will remain, for it is higher than all before, is that I can do anything. Not only with regard to a particular work. When I write down a sentence at random, for example, "He looked out the window," it is already perfect. August 20th, 1911. I have been reading about Dickens. Is it so hard, and can an outsider comprehend that one experiences a story in oneself from its beginning, from the distant point to the approaching locomotive of steel, coal, and steam? Even now, one does not want to abandon it, but wants to be chased by it. And having time for this, is chased by it and runs in front of it by one's own impetus, wherever it thrusts and wherever one lures it. I can't understand and can't even believe it. I live only here and there in a little word, in whose vowel thrusts above, for example, I lose my useless head for a moment. First and last letter are beginning and end of my fish-like feeling. October 2nd, 1911. Sleepless night, the third in a row. I fall asleep easily, but after an hour I wake up as if I had laid my head in a false hole. I'm completely awake, have the feeling of having slept not at all or only under a thin skin, have the work of falling asleep ahead of me anew, and feel rejected by sleep. And the rest of the night until toward 5, it goes on in such a way that I do sleep, but at the same time, intense dreams keep me awake. I am practically sleeping next to myself while I myself must grapple with dreams. Toward 5, the last trace of sleep is used up. I only dream, which is a greater strain than being awake. In short, I spend the whole night in the state in which a healthy person finds himself for a little while before actually falling asleep. When I wake up, all the dreams are gathered around me, but I take care not to think them through. Toward morning, I sigh into my pillow because for this night, all hope is gone. I believe this sleeplessness stems only from the fact that I write. For as little and as badly as I write, these small shocks make me sensitive, I feel, especially toward evening, and even more in the morning. The wafting, the imminent possibility of great states that would tear me open and could make me capable of anything. And then the general noise that is in me and that I have no time to command grants me no rest. In the end, this noise is only a suppressed, restrained harmony, which, if set free, would completely fill me, indeed, would expand me, and even then fill me. But now, aside from raising faint hopes, this state only does me harm, since my nature doesn't have enough capacity to bear the present mixture. During the day, the visible world helps me. At night, all this cuts me up unhindered. October 3rd, 1911. Dictating a fairly long report to a district administration in the office. At the conclusion, which was supposed to rise to a climax, I got stuck and could do nothing but look at the typist, Kaiser, who, as is her habit, became especially lively, shifted her chair, coughed, tapped around on the table, and so drew the attention of the whole room to my misfortune. The idea I've been searching for now takes on the added value that it will calm her down, and the more valuable it becomes, the harder it is to find. At last, I have the word, stigmatize, and the sentence that goes with it, but still, everything in my mouth I hold with a feeling of disgust and shame, as if it were raw meat cut out of my own flesh. So much effort has it cost me. At last, I say it, but retain the great horror that everything in me is ready for a literary work, and such a work would be a heavenly dissolution and a real coming alive for me. While here in the office, for the sake of so wretched a document, I must rob a body capable of such happiness of a piece of its flesh. October 17th, 1911. I finish nothing because I have no time. And there's so much pressure in me. If the whole day were free and this morning restlessness could rise in me by noon and tire itself out by evening, then I could sleep. As it is, however, there remains for this restlessness only a twilight hour at most. It grows somewhat stronger, is then suppressed, and uselessly and harmfully digs up the night for me. Will I be able to bear it for long? And is there any purpose in bearing it? Will I then gain time? November 5th, 1911. The bitterness I felt yesterday evening when Max read aloud my little automobile story at Baum's. I was isolated from everyone, and in the face of the story, I positively kept my chin pressed to my chest. The disordered sentences of this story, with gaps through which one could stick both hands. One sentence sounds high, one sentence sounds low, as the case may be. One sentence rubs against the next like the tongue against a hollow or false tooth. One sentence comes marching up with so rough a beginning that the whole story falls into morose astonishment. A sleepy imitation of Max sways in. Sometimes it looks like a dancing course in its first 15 minutes. I explain to myself by saying that I don't have enough time and peace to bring up from my depths the possibilities of my talent in their entirety. Therefore, it's always only broken off beginnings that come to the surface. Broken off beginnings, for example, through the whole automobile story. If I were ever able to write a larger whole, well-formed from beginning to end, then the story would never be able to detach itself from me definitively, and I might listen calmly and with open eyes, as a blood relative of a healthy story to a reading of it. But as it is, every little piece of the story wanders homelessly and drives me in the opposite direction. November 15th, 1911. Yesterday evening, already with a presentiment, pulled the cover off the bed, lay down, and again became aware of all my abilities, as if I were holding them in my hand. They tightened my chest, they inflamed my head. For a little while, to console myself for not getting up to work, I repeated, "That can't be healthy, that can't be healthy." And with almost visible intent, tried to pull sleep over my head. I kept thinking of a cap with a visor that, to protect myself, I pushed down over my forehead with a strong hand. How much I lost yesterday, how the blood was pressed in my cramped head, capable of anything, and only held by forces that are indispensable for my mere life and are being wasted here. There's no doubt that everything I've invented in advance, even in a good feeling, word for word, or just roughly, but in explicit words, on the desk, in the attempt to write it down, appears dry, wrong, immobile, obstructive to all that surrounds it, anxious, but above all, full of gaps. Even though nothing of the original invention has been forgotten, this is naturally due in large part to the fact that I invent good things free of paper, only in the time of exaltation, which I fear more than I yearn for it, however much I do yearn for it. But that then the fullness is so great that I have to refrain, thus blindly take only what I grab at random out of the stream, so that in the considered act of writing it down, this acquisition is nothing in comparison to the fullness in which it lived, is incapable of bringing back this fullness, and therefore is bad and disturbing because it tempts uselessly. November 21st, 1911. There is no doubt that a main obstacle to my progress is my physical condition. With such a body, nothing can be achieved. I will have to get used to its perpetual failure. From the last few wildly dreamed through, but barely even snatchily slept through nights, I was so incoherent this morning, felt nothing but my forehead, saw a halfway bearable condition only far beyond the present one, and in sheer readiness for death at one point would have liked to curl up with the documents in my hand on the cement tiles of the corridor. My body is too long for its weakness. It is not the least fat to generate a blessed warmth, to preserve inner fire. No fat on which the spirit might at some point nourish itself beyond its daily need without damage to the whole. How is the weak heart, which recently has often stabbed me, supposed to push the blood down the whole length of these legs? To the knee would be enough work, but then it is washed with only decrepit strength into the cold lower legs. But now it is already needed again up above. One waits for it while it dissipates down below. Due to the length of the body, everything is pulled apart. What can it accomplish then when, perhaps even if it were compressed, it wouldn't have enough strength for what I want to achieve? December 8th, 1911. I have now, and already had in the afternoon, a great longing to write my whole anxious condition wholly out of me, and just as it comes out of the depths, to write it into the depths of the paper, or to write it down in such a way that I can incorporate what I've written fully into me. December 13th, 1911. When I begin to write after a long time, I pull the words as if out of the empty air. If one is attained, then it's only this one here, and all the work begins anew. December 23rd, 1911. An advantage of keeping a diary consists in the fact that one becomes aware with reassuring clarity of the transformations one incessantly undergoes, which one naturally believes, senses, and admits in general to, but which one unconsciously denies whenever it's a matter of gaining hope or peace from such an admission. In the diary, one finds proof that even in conditions that today seem unbearable, one lived. looked around, and wrote down observations, that this right hand thus moved as it does today, when the possibility of surveying our condition at that time does make us wiser, but we therefore must recognize all the more the undauntedness of our striving at that time, which in sheer ignorance nonetheless sustained itself. December 27th, 1911. The feeling of falseness I have when writing could be represented by the image of a man waiting in front of two holes in the ground for an apparition that can come only out of the one on the right. But while this very hole remains under a faintly visible lid, one apparition after another rises out of the one on the left, seeks to draw his eyes to itself, and in the end achieves this effortlessly by its growing size, which finally, however much he tries to ward it off, covers even the correct opening. But now, if the man doesn't want to leave this place, and he doesn't want that at any price, he is reliant on these apparitions, which, however, due to their fleetingness, their strength is used up in the mere appearing, cannot satisfy him, but which, when they falter, out of weakness, he dispels upwards and in all directions, only to bring up others, since the continuous sight of one is unbearable, and since the hope also remains that after exhaustion of the false apparitions, the true ones will finally ascend. January 3rd, 1912. In me, a concentration on writing can be recognized quite easily. When it had become clear in my organism that writing was the most productive direction of my being, everything thronged there and left empty all the abilities that were directed towards the pleasures of sex, eating, drinking, philosophical reflection, music, first and foremost. I wasted away in all these directions. This was necessary because my powers in their entirety were so slight that only gathered could they halfway serve the purpose of writing. Naturally, I didn't find this purpose independently and consciously. It found itself and is now hindered only by the office, but here thoroughly so. In any case, however, I must not bemoan the fact that I can't bear a beloved, that I understand of love almost exactly as much as I do of music, and have to content myself with the most superficial chance effects, that on New Year's Eve I had black salsify with spinach for dinner and drank with it a quarter-liter of Ceres, and that on Sunday I couldn't participate in Max's reading of his philosophical work. The compensation for all this is perfectly clear. Thus, I only have to throw the office work out of this community in order, since my development is now completed, and as far as I can see, I have nothing more to sacrifice, to begin my real life, in which my face will at last be able to age in a natural way with the progress of my works. February 25th, 1912. Hold fast the diary from today on. Write regularly. Don't give up. Even if no salvation comes, I want to be worthy of it at every moment. March 8th, 1912. Read through some old papers. It takes all one's strength to bear it. The unhappiness one must endure when one interrupts oneself in a task that can only ever succeed at one stretch. And this has always happened to me up to now. In reading through things, one must go through this unhappiness, even if not with the old intensity, in a more compressed way. March 18th, 1912. I was wise, if you will, because I was prepared to die at any moment. But this was not because I had taken care of everything I was required to do, but rather because I had done none of it, and also couldn't hope ever to do any of it. June 1st, 1912, wrote nothing. June 2nd, 1912, wrote almost nothing. June 7th, 1912, awful, wrote nothing today, no time tomorrow. July 8th, 1912, began a little, am a little sleepy, also forsaken among these complete strangers. July 9th, 1912, have written nothing for so long, begin tomorrow. Otherwise, I'll end up in a prolonged, inexorable dissatisfaction. I'm actually already in it. The nervous states are beginning, but if I can do something, then I can do it without superstitious precautions. August 30th, 1912. This month, which due to the absence of my boss could have been used especially well, I have, without much justification, idled away and slept away. Even this afternoon, I stretched out on the bed with dreamy excuses for 3 hours. September 23rd, 1912. This story, The Judgment, I wrote at one stretch on the night of the 22nd to the 23rd, from 10 o'clock in the evening until 6 o'clock in the morning. My legs had grown so stiff from sitting that I could hardly pull them out from under the desk. The terrible strain and joy, how the story unfolded itself before me, how I moved forward in an expanse of water. Several times last night, I bore my weight on my back. How everything can be risked, how for the strangest ideas, a great fire is prepared in which they die away and rise again. How it turned blue outside the window. A carriage passed. 2 men walked across the bridge. At 2 o'clock, I looked for the last time at the clock. As the maid walked through the hall for the first time, I wrote down the last sentence, putting out the lamp and daylight. The slight heart pains, the tiredness passing away in the middle of the night, the trembling entrance into my sister's room, reading aloud. Beforehand, stretching in front of the maid and saying, "I've been writing until now." The appearance of the untouched bed as if it had just been carried in, the confirmed conviction that with my novel writing, I am in disgraceful lowlands of writing. Only in this way can writing be done, only with such cohesion, with such complete opening of the body and the soul. Morning in bed, the always clear eyes. June 2nd, 1913. The tremendous world I have in my head, but how to free myself and free it without being torn to pieces. And 1,000 times better to be torn to pieces than to retain or bury it in me. That's why I'm here, after all. That's completely clear to me. November 18th, 1913. I will write again, but how many doubts I've had in the meantime about my writing. At bottom, I am an incapable, ignorant person who, if he hadn't been compelled, without any merit of his own, scarcely aware of the compulsion to go to school, would have just barely been fit to sit in a doghouse, to leap out when he is given food and to leap back when he has devoured it. April 8th, 1914. Yesterday, incapable of writing even a word. Today, no better. Who will save me? And within me, the throng, deep down, scarcely visible. I'm like a living lattice work, a lattice that stands firm and wants to fall. July 29th, 1914. Began failed works, but I won't yield despite sleeplessness, headaches, general inability. It is the last vital energy that has gathered itself in me for this. I've made the observation that I avoid people not in order to be able to live in peace, but in order to be able to die in peace. But now I will defend myself. For a month during my boss's absence, I'll have time. August 6th, 1914. From the perspective of literature, my fate is very simple. The penchant for depicting my dreamlike inner life has pushed everything else aside, and all this has atrophied in a terrible way and doesn't cease to atrophy. Nothing else can ever satisfy me. But for now, my strength for that depiction is quite incalculable. Perhaps it has vanished forever. Perhaps it will come over me again. The circumstances of my life are certainly not favorable to it. Thus, I waver, fly incessantly to the peak of the mountain, but can keep myself up there for scarcely a moment. Others waver too, but in lower regions with stronger powers. If they are in danger of falling, they are caught by the relative who walks beside them for that purpose. I, however, waver up there. It is, alas, not death, but the eternal torments of dying. August 15th, 1914. I've been writing for a few days. May it last. Today, I'm not quite as sheltered and burrowed away in my work as I was 2 years ago. Nonetheless, I do have a sense that my regular, empty, mad bachelor life has a justification. I can again carry on a conversation with myself and don't stare so into complete emptiness. Only in this way is there an improvement for me. December 8th, 1914. Yesterday, unquestionably capable of good work for the first time in a long while, and yet wrote only the first page of the chapter, since I had barely slept at all for 2 nights, since a headache had already made its presence known in the morning. Everything written down in fragments, and not in the course of the greater part of the night, or even its entirety, is inferior, and that I am condemned to this inferiority by the circumstances of my life. December 13th, 1914. On the way home, I told Max that on my deathbed, provided that the pains are not too great, I will be very content. I forgot to add, and later omitted intentionally, that the best of what I have written stems from this ability to die contentedly. All those good and strongly convincing passages always deal with the fact that someone is dying, that this is very difficult for them, that in it he experiences an injustice and at least a hardship, and that for the reader, at least in my opinion, this is moving. For me, however, believing as I do in my ability to be content on my deathbed, such depictions are secretly a gain. Indeed, I am happy to die in the dying man. Therefore, calculatingly take advantage of the attention the reader concentrates on death, am far more clear-headed than he, who I assume will lament on his deathbed, and my lament is therefore as perfect as possible. Does not, for example, suddenly break off like a real lament, but rather trails away beautifully and purely. It's like my perpetual lamenting to my mother over woes not nearly as great as the lament led one to believe. For my mother, to be sure, I didn't need as much artistic effort as for the reader. January 4th, 1915. Didn't yield to my great desire to begin a new story. It's all useless. When I can't chase the stories through the nights, they escape and get lost. January 30th, 1915. The old inability. Stopped writing for barely 10 days and already cast out. Again, the great exertions lie ahead. It is necessary positively to dive under and sink more quickly than what is sinking away in front of you. February 25th, 1915. After days of uninterrupted headaches, finally a little freer and more confident. If I were a stranger observing me and the course of my life, I would have to say that it all must end in uselessness, expended in incessant doubt, creative only in self-torment. But as a participant, I hope. February 15th, 1920. It is a matter of the following. I was sitting once, many years ago, certainly sad enough, on the slopes of the Laurenzeeberg. I examined the wishes I had for life. It turned out that the most important or the most appealing wish was to gain a view of life, and this was, to be sure, necessarily connected, to be able to convince others of it in writing, in which life, while retaining its natural heavy falling and rising, would at the same time be recognized with no less clarity as a nothing, as a dream, as a hovering, a beautiful wish, perhaps, if I had wished it correctly. Say, as the wish to hammer together a table with painstakingly proper craftsmanship, and at the same time, do nothing. And indeed, not in such a way that one could say, well, to him, the hammering is a nothing, but rather, to him, the hammering is a real hammering, and at the same time, also a nothing. Whereby the hammering truly would have become even bolder, even more resolute, even more real, and, if you will, even madder. But he could not wish in that way at all, for his wish was no wish. It was only a defense, a domestication of the nothing, a touch of liveliness that he wanted to give to the nothing, into which, At that time, he had, it is true, scarcely taken the first conscious steps, but which he already felt to be his element. It was a sort of farewell that he bid the illusory world of youth at that time. It had, by the way, never directly deceived him, but only let him be deceived by the speeches of all the authorities surrounding him. Thus had the necessity of the wish arisen. October 17th, 1921. It's possible that there's an intention behind the fact that I have learned nothing useful, and, this is connected, also let myself decline physically. I wanted to remain undistracted by the joy a useful and healthy man finds in life, as if illness and despair would not distract me at least as much. I could round off this thought in various ways and thereby bring it to a conclusion in my favor, but I don't dare, and believe, at least today, and so in the majority of days, in no solution favorable to me. January 16th, 1922. This past week, there seemed to be a breakdown. As complete as perhaps only on that night 2 years ago, I have not experienced another precedent. Everything seemed over, and even today seems not to have changed very much at all. One can understand it in two ways, and it is also probably to be understood in both at the same time. First, breakdown, impossibility of sleeping, impossibility of waking, impossibility of enduring life, or more precisely, the succession of life. The clocks are not synchronized. The inner one races in a devilish or demonic, or in any case, inhuman way. The outer one haltingly takes its usual course. What else can happen but that the two different worlds separate? And they are separating, or at least tugging at each other in a terrible way. There may be various reasons for the furiousness of the inner movement. The most visible one is the self-observation that lets no idea come to rest, chases each one upward, only in turn to be chased further itself as an idea by new self-observation. Second, this chasing is heading in the direction out of humanity. The loneliness that has always been, for the most part, imposed on me, in part been sought by me. Yet what was this but compulsion, too, is now becoming completely unambiguous and is going to the extreme. Where is it leading? It can, this seems most compulsory of all, lead to insanity. About that, nothing more can be said. The chase goes through me and tears me up. Or I can, be it even only to the tiniest extent, maintain myself. Thus let myself be borne by the chase. Then where will I end up? Chase is only an image, after all. I can also say, onslaught against the last earthly boundary, and indeed an onslaught from below, from humanity, and can, since this too is only an image, replace it with the image of the onslaught from above down toward me. January 23rd, 1922. Restlessness from the fact that my life until now has been a marching in place. A development at most in the sense a tooth becoming hollow and decaying undergoes one. The way I led my life never proved its worth in the slightest. It was as if I, like every other person, had been given the center of a circle, as if I then, like every other person, had to follow the decisive radius and then draw the beautiful circle. Instead, I have perpetually started the radius, but again and again had to break it off immediately. Examples: piano, violin, languages, German studies, anti-Zionism, Zionism, Hebrew, gardening, carpentry, literature, marriage attempts, an apartment of my own. The center of the imaginary circle bristles with beginnings of radii. There is no more space for a new attempt. No space means age, weakness of nerves, and no further attempt means the end. If I ever have brought the radius a little bit farther than usual, perhaps in the case of my law studies or engagements, everything was simply worse by this little bit instead of better. January 24th, 1922. The hesitation before birth. If there is a transmigration of souls, then I am not yet on the lowest rung. My life is the hesitation before birth. January 27th, 1922. Strange, mysterious, perhaps dangerous, perhaps saving consolation of writing. The leap out of the killer's ranks. Deed, observation. Deed, observation. In that a higher kind of observation is created. A higher, not a sharper kind. And the higher it is, and the more unreachable from the ranks, the more independent it becomes. The more obedient to its own laws of motion, the more incalculable, joyful, rising its path. June 12th, 1923. More and more anxious while writing. It is understandable. Every word twisted in the hand of the spirits. This flourish of the hand is their characteristic movement. Becomes a spear turned against the speaker. A remark like this, most especially. And so on to infinity. The consolation would be, it happens whether you want it or not. And what you want helps only imperceptibly little. More than consolation is, you too have weapons.
Well, this was amazing. And Josh's reading was also revealing to me.
Me too. Yeah.
It made me think that Kafka wrote the diaries in order for them to be read aloud, which I am not sure he did. But we know that Kafka occasionally did read his work in the public or for his friends, and the public was laughing, and it was so satisfactory to hear the audience laughing tonight as well. So I would like to ask Ross, how was this experience for you, listening to your words, Kafka's words in your own rendering, and now to listen to them?
Just moving beyond expression, I feel like it was utterly revelatory to me. You know, in a way, it makes me want to celebrate even more the art of translation in the most capacious sense that Kafka wrote these words, and who knows how much even he knew what he meant while he was writing them, right? He was writing in his diaries and trying to figure out what he was thinking in the act of writing, and didn't necessarily even fully reflect on, say, what he meant. And then these words were not necessarily meant for posterity, but they were saved by Max Brod, and after Kafka died, and they came down to us in different forms, older editions, newer editions, and then I translated them also without really knowing what does Kafka truly mean, and trying to do my own rendition. And in a way, the act still wasn't complete until tonight. It felt like a further act of completion of filling the words with meaning in a way that was as revelatory to me as anyone else, or even I would claim a kind of privileged level of revelation tonight, that it seemed to come alive to me after all these years of wrestling with these words, to see them embodied and physically translated and emotionally translated. It was just...
Yeah, so you say after many years, so can you tell us a little bit about the process of translation? How did you get to translate Kafka's diaries? How long
8 years,
did you
yeah.
live with them? Which is
The answer is 8 years,
Yeah.
My daughter just turned 8. Yeah, but that was already, the diaries have already been out for a little while. She's only known me to be working on this her whole life. And I'm still going around talking about it now. It's still all I'm doing. It's the most difficult thing I ever translated without, I'm a little superstitious about saying so, but I suspect it will be the most difficult thing I ever do translate.
Did you translate any other Kafka's works? I mean, so to say you translated the Diaries is almost misleading because this edition, this full edition, actually contains Kafka's stories as well. And I have never seen them included, integrated in an actual edition, except, of course, for the German critical editions. But we know stories such as The Judgment, and there is the first chapter of the novel that was called by Max Brod America, and they are here as part of the Diaries, and yeah.
Yeah, he wrote them in the Diaries, so we kind of witnessed that moment tonight, except that I didn't include The Judgment in the script because that would have taken up all our time, as amazing as that may have been.
But so in a way, you not only translated the Diaries, you also
right.
translated...
So we witnessed the diary entry that comes after he wrote The Judgment, which is where he expresses his elation about having written it just now. But in the diaries themselves, this actually happens. And I find that so invaluable to have that actually on the page, to witness this actually happen on the page. Of course, you're not looking at his handwriting, you're not even looking at the German anymore when you're looking at my translation. But what I tried to capture in the translation by very closely following the German edition that so closely follows his handwriting is how in the act of composition, you can almost trace those moments that he describes in the following entry where he says, like, I stopped looking out the window and soon I was only writing, I never looked up from the page again. You can trace it in the text on the page as he starts to drop punctuation and paragraph breaks and quotation marks and commas because he's being swept up in this inspiration of writing. And so the words didn't change very much when he prepared The Judgment for publication and created a clean copy of it. He changed, there's a handful of variants between the version he published in his lifetime and the version in the diaries, but very few. But what's so different, I think, is seeing the sort of traces of the creative process as this moment that was for him probably the high point of his creativity that he then sought to recapture, and that was, traced in the performance tonight, how he never really recaptured again that sense of cohesion of writing something in a single sitting. This kind of perfect picture of creative...
I think you wrote or said in your intro that you felt like you caught Kafka in the act of his writing. So this is what you mean?
That's what I mean. I expressed it much more succinctly in the...
Yeah, okay. It's also interesting to think of... So it's... we don't know how Kafka was really writing, but it seems like it's flowing, often really flowing. I imagine translating was not flowing as much.
Yeah, in a way, I wouldn't say necessarily that it's always flowing. It's like he would get into a flow, but then he was always interrupted. Right. And that became very, it's both, sometimes it's really choppy. I think they captured some of that with these really short staccato entries. Sometimes he's really struggling to get the flow. And then you have all these false starts. So there are sometimes dozens of entries where he's trying his hand at what is perceptibly the same material or variations of the same story that he's trying to realize. And he'll start again and again with some of the same words, but take it in a different direction, but then stop again and start again. And this stopping and starting, certainly in translation, was one of the challenges because every time he got into a flow, I could get into a flow. Oh, I'm starting to really feel the voice and the rhythm of this piece, the music of this piece, and I'm writing it, but then all of a sudden he
Yeah, I mean, it's paradoxical to say it's flowing when most of the actual topic is is not being able to write, not being able to sleep, right?
It's
At least
both,
in those
yeah.
in those sections that you chose for us to listen to.
Yeah, I mean, it was very important to me not to render the whole thing as a smooth flow, which is, I think, one of the stark differences between my edition and the old edition that was, heavily edited and tidied up, is that edition has much more that smooth veneer of a literary text that flows. It's much more cohesive. All those broken up staccato series of reworkings of the same text are usually just discarded in favor of like one composite text where they're pieced together. And by his former editor, his literary executor, Max Brod, who edited that edition. And that smooth flow, to me, is deceptive, or it's not as interesting, really, as what we get when we get closer to the text that Kafka wrote, which was the actual flow of his writing, which was not uniformly smooth, and at its greatest moments suddenly came out of him like a birth, as he says of the Judgment in another period. He says it came out of me like a birth covered in filth and slime, and only I have the hand that can penetrate to the body. And then he proceeds to interpret the Judgment. But those moments of great creative flow that were for him a kind of salvation, I think, they're kind of sponsored by the moments of disruption, interrupted flow. And I find it much more interesting as a translator, too, to try to capture those variations. Of course, it's much more challenging.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, can you tell us a little bit about the diaries themselves? So you say it's 1910 through 1923, and we read the very last words that Kafka actually wrote in his diary in 1923. You two have weapons, right? Is it quite powerful ending? And then what happened with the diaries themselves? Like before, I guess, they got to be published for the first time.
Yeah, it's a complex story of fraught afterlife that these diaries have had, along with most of the writings Kafka hadn't published in his lifetime. It might have started around 1909. The first entries are undated, so it's unclear exactly where they started. But 1909 to 1923, he was writing them. But then there's this moment very late in the diaries, around 1920, 1921, where there's an entry that says, just handed over all the diaries to M. And M is Melina Jesenska, the Czech journalist, and his first translator, Czech translator and critic, who translated The Stoker and The Judgment from German into Czech. And with whom he had a epistolary love affair. He wrote her beautiful love letters that are currently having a renaissance on TikTok, actually, among young TikTok influencers who...
Yeah, teenage.
Yeah, who imagine, because of these amazing love letters he wrote, that Kafka was a very good boyfriend, or would be a very good boyfriend.
Yeah,
when he's historically the worst boyfriend in literary history.
It's one of the most amazing... reoccurrence or
reinventions.
Reinventions of Kafka, really.
Yeah, it just goes. It's all part of this same tapestry of reinventions and afterlife. But yeah, so he gave Milena either as an act of courtship or an act of self-disclosure, or even just showing off, because like you said, the diaries are literary writings. He did sometimes plan to read them aloud to his friends from these very pages. He writes in the diaries about wanting to read them to his friends and trying to pick out some passages to read. So he gave them to Melina. So that kind of answers the question, were they for an audience? At some point, at least, when he handed them to her, they were for at least an audience of one. And at that point, where that entry stands in the diaries, he had ripped out all the previous pages of that notebook and given her all the preceding notebooks. He wrote the rest of that notebook, which is just a slim portion to those last parts of the diaries. And then he left for Max Brod, who he appointed the executor of his literary estate when he died. And at the age of 40 in 1924, he left Max Brod a letter saying to collect his scattered, unpublished papers, his manuscripts and diaries, and the letters were with the recipients, to collect all of that and then to burn it. Brod had refused anytime Kafka had explicitly asked him to do that, or in person asked him to do that. So it was one of these acts of purely Kafka Kafkan ambivalence, right? To ask the one person who said they would never burn your papers to burn them.
Yeah.
Which is, doesn't mean he didn't want him to burn them. It's just he's really the poster child of ambivalence. So Brode, as he had promised, did not burn them, but almost immediately, within weeks of Kafka's death, began the project of publishing the unpublished novels.
Right.
And then in the decades that followed, he brought into print the diaries, the letters, and so on. And in this act of exposing Kafka, interestingly, he was also sort of protecting him and covering him up a little. So in the case of the fiction manuscripts, he was covering up Kafka's technical imperfections or cleaning them up in the way maybe he imagined Kafka would have if he had prepared them for publication in his lifetime, making these really, taking great liberties in his editorial decisions. And in the case of the letters and diaries, he became even more censorious because he was also protecting Kafka's image or protecting an image maybe he had of Kafka or even what he thought he knew of who Kafka truly was. And so he was cutting out anything that didn't conform to that picture, including in the diaries, passages where Kafka expresses same-sex desire, passages where he expresses a kind of more lascivious, lewd attitude toward, say, sex workers or women's bodies, and passages where he's more ambivalent about his Judaism or Zionism in general. And in doing that, Brode was both kind of exposing Kafka beyond his wishes and in some way also keeping Kafka from us in a way. We didn't get kind of the full picture of who Kafka was until after Brode died.
Right.
Brode had complete control over the manuscripts and their translations. So Brode prepared these German manuscripts, and those were the basis of all translations worldwide. He died in 1968. We're getting to the end of it. Scholars only then really discovered how much he had altered and doctored the manuscripts. And in the course of the 80s and early 90s, a German edition came out that was much more faithful to the manuscripts, kept the mistakes, the lack of punctuation, but also the passages that were inscrutable or even seemed marginal, and gave us this picture of Kafka that then has kind of limped its way into English over the decades that followed incompletely. And the diaries, I first read them maybe 10 years after they were published in German in the early 2000s, thinking I was going to go back and read the German original of the English version I'd read in high school and loved so much. And when I read the German, it was a completely different text and was astonishingly alive and loose and gave me this picture of Kafka in his humanity, in his imperfections. But
So you knew right away that you would like to bring this full Kafka to English.
I always figured it would have happened. I mean, when I first read them, I wasn't a translator yet. I had only just become capable of reading them in German. And I thought, I'm sure this must be, about to come out in English. It's already been 10 years. Someone's probably been working on it all this time. And it's about to come out. And then by the time I was a translator, it still hadn't come out. That was, very surprising to me. And even then, I wasn't yet at a place in my career where I had the opportunity. And only once the opportunity arose to propose a project that was kind of a dream project was.
Well, the dream is here. Let's talk about Prague for a moment, or Czech Kafka. So I know you spent some time in Prague, and we can say that's not very important. Like we can appreciate Kafka, not being in Prague, but I think everyone around the world reads him, but I think there is something very special about really Kafka and Prague. And so I would like to ask you about that, how that came in, but also mention how was Kafka important for Czech readers, despite him being banned, as Pavla Niklova mentioned at the start. And so despite his work not being published for 40 years, almost for the entire 40 years, people distributed his work, typed his work in samizdat, shared it, and I would still argue he was one of the most influential authors. Vaclav Havel, for example, and many other dissidents saw in them the kind of authentic being that they themselves strove to be. quoted many times from the diaries. Havel, in one of his letters from prison in 1979, wrote a number of letters, actually from prison to his wife, where he wrote, and maybe I will just quote here very briefly because it's such a fascinating letter. He wrote, I have always harbored a feeling hidden, since it might raise suspicions of arrogance, that I somehow understand Kafka better than others, not because I can claim deeper intellectual insight into his work, but because of an intensely personal and existential understanding of experience that borders on spiritual kinship, if I may put it that way. And he's just one of many, many. So I was wondering why do you think that Kafka talks to so many different audiences over so many decades and people can really identify with him so intimately and profoundly?
Yeah, I think it's so interesting. I mean, Havel's words are probably the feeling of millions of readers of Kafka, right? That they have a special kinship with him. And that's part of why the Kafka wars over, who defines Kafka or how do we define Kafka have sometimes become so personal in a way. Even, within some of the reception of the diaries, there's been people who, I guess, one of the more critical reviews of the diaries began autobiographically with the critic of the review talking about when they first got the old edition of the diaries and what it meant to them in their adolescence. And then when I wrote a sort of my own, it wasn't a response to that, but my own, and I'd already begun it before I saw that piece when I wrote my own sort of story of how I came to translate the diaries. It was the same thing. I started when I was 15 and first encountered Kafka. And so, I mean, Havel, there are uncanny, resonances between the types of struggles that Kafka was describing in his fiction and in his work and the history that came after him. And those have been almost overstated even though they in a way can't be overstated because it is uncanny, the prescience of Kafka's work and the way in which he seemed to describe what actually happened to, for one thing, the European Jewry, and then for another thing,
the communist totalitarianism.
Yeah, totalitarianism. Of his own city. So it's an extraordinary part of this afterlife, and in a way, everything from Havel to TikTok, everybody can do something with Kafka, and the appeal seems to be irresistible. You don't find many objectors even to Kafka the way you do to maybe, I don't know, Virginia Woolf, somebody who's really up on a pedestal, but then there are people, there are those who don't get it or whatever. With Kafka, maybe some people are indifferent, but most readers of Kafka are also lovers of Kafka who have this very personal relationship. So I guess I'm just restating the question because I don't know what it is. I mean, he expresses, such sensitivity, anxiety, pain, these very quintessentially modern experiences that probably speak to us all in the 20th and 21st century.
So being so private and so intimate, and at the same time being able to resonate in
there's
so many
this
contexts.
Biography called Franz Kafka, Representative Man, an older biography. But that sense that he's somehow representative, but he can be representative for so many different, he can be representative of the Jewish experience, the Czech experience, and then you go back to the text and it's so strange and elusive and flips out of all those categories. And that's maybe that's sort of the key to it, is that because it can't be reduced to any of these interpretations, it's also so fertile for interpretation, because it's fertile for over-interpretation and has been interpreted, and will just continue to do that now, tonight, and forever probably. And that's how the work lives on, and that's why it has this rich afterlife. And sorry, just to get to the first part of your question, I know I warned you I was going to talk too long in my answers, but the Prague part is just that Prague was so important for me.
Most important.
Very, very important for me. And I maybe didn't know how important, but it's a kind of fulcrum because I went there largely, I probably knew what about Prague mainly because of Kafka. I probably wouldn't have known it was on the map in my ignorance if it hadn't been for Kafka, but of course I discovered him as a teenager and then had dreamt of Kafka's Prague from then on. And I went there largely to, trace Kafka's footsteps and spent a lot of time just walking around. But then when it came full circle and I was translating the diaries, once I sort of figured out which German street names corresponded to which Czech street names, the topography of the city had changed so little. The biggest changes happened in Kafka's lifetime when they demolished the Jewish quarter. Those streets changed, but by the time he's taking his walks, they're the same walks you take in Prague today, and that I had taken so almost religiously in Prague. And so as I was translating, it occurred to me that was one thing that I wasn't, there's so much that you research exhaustingly and hopefully exhaustively, but that was something more tactile that I could, walk through the city with him and sort of in an embodied way that was so important for me to come back into the text and feel like I'm inside of it. And so Prague was so important to me for that it wasn't an abstraction.
Right. Yeah. So and we heard just one topographical name in the readings, Laurenziberg, which is of course the Petrin Hill, the German, right?
Yes, it is.
German name for what probably most of you know as the Petrin Hill, the main hill with the little.
And when you first stumble on that hill, or if the best way to find it is to stumble on it, or at least it's the best way for me because it's how I found it. I was just wandering around, and then I was like, I'm going to go up this hill. And there's this hill here, a super famous hill. Maybe I should have known it was there, but I was just wandering around in Malá Strana, and then I went up this hill, and suddenly the whole city opens. I mean, it's just exhilarating.
Yep.
And he was sitting on that hill making those wishes,
Said
or at
enough.
least writing.
Said enough, I think.
Yeah.
Right? Said enough.
At least writing later that's what he was doing on that hill in that extraordinary passage about hammering together a table, but at the same time doing nothing. Yeah.
We could continue for much longer, but I think we do need to stop here.